Hello. So, I'm back after my week off, since I was off at a concert, and we'll be continuing where we left off last week. Well, not even last week, 2 weeks ago, and I feel kind of bad because I've actually forgotten a little bit. I just remember that we had found out via a letter that the mysterious woman in white was a former student and bears an uncanny resemblance to one of the young women our art teacher is now tutoring. And I think, since it was kind of a short stream, that might have been the biggest plot development. But let's get started. So ended my eventful first day at Limmeridge House. Miss Holcomb and I kept our secret. After the discovery of the likeness, no fresh light seemed destined to break over the mystery of the woman in white. At the first safe opportunity, Miss Holcomb cautiously led her half-sister to speak of their mother, of old times, and of Anne Catherick. Miss Fairley's recollection of the little scholar at Limmeridge were, however, only of the most vague and general kind. She remembered the likeness between herself and her mother's favorite pupil as something which had been supposed to exist in past times, but she did not refer to the gift of the white dresses or to the singular form of words in which the child had artlessly expressed her gratitude for them. She remembered that Anne had remained at Limmeridge for a few months only, and had then left to go back to her home in Hampshire, but she could not say whether the mother and daughter had ever returned, or had ever been heard of afterwards. No further search on Miss Holcomb's part, through the few letters of Mrs. Fairley's writings, which she had left unread, assisted in clearing up the uncertainties still left to perplex us. We had identified the unhappy woman whom I had met in the night time with Anne Catherick. We had made some advance, at least, towards connecting the probably defective condition of the poor creature's intellect with the peculiarity of her being dressed all in white, and with the continuance, in her maturer years, of her childish gratitude toward Mrs. Fairley, and there, so far as we knew at the time, our discoveries had ended. The days passed on, the weeks passed on, and the track of the golden autumn wound its bright way visibly through the green summer of the trees. Peaceful, fast-flowing, happy time. My story glides by you now as swiftly as you once glided by me. Of all the treasures of enjoyment that you poured so freely into my heart, how much is left me that has purpose and value enough to be written on this page? Nothing but the saddest of all confessions that a man can make, the confession of his own folly. The secret which that confession discloses should be told with little effort, for it has indirectly escaped me already. The poor, weak words which have failed to describe Miss Fairley have succeeded in betraying the sensations she awakened in me. It is so with us all. Our words are giants when they do us an injury, and dwarfs when they do us a service. I loved her. Ah, how well I know all the sadness and all the mockery that is contained in those 3 words. I can sigh over my mournful confession with the tenderest woman who reads it and pities me. I can laugh at it as bitterly as the hardest man who tosses it from him in contempt. I loved her. Feel for me or despise me, I confess it with the same immovable resolution to own the truth. Was there no excuse for me? There was some excuse to be found surely in the conditions under which my term of hired service was passed at Limmeridge House. My morning hours succeeded each other calmly in the quiet and seclusion of my own room. I had just work enough to do in mounting my employer's drawings to keep my hands and eyes pleasurably employed, while my mind was left free to enjoy the dangerous luxury of its own unbridled thoughts. A perilous solitude, for it lasted long enough to enervate, not long enough to fortify me. A perilous solitude, for it followed by afternoons and evenings spent, day after day and week after week, alone in the society of two women, one of whom possessed all the accomplishments of grace, wit, and high breeding, the other all the charms of beauty, gentleness, and simple truth that can purify and subdue the heart of man. Not a day passed in that dangerous intimacy of teacher and pupil in which my hand was not close to Miss Fairley's, my cheek as we bent together over her sketchbook almost touching hers. The more attentively she watched every movement of my brush, the more closely I was breathing the perfume of her hair and the warm fragrance of her breath. It was part of my service to live in the very light of her eyes, at one time to be bending over her, so close to her bosom as to tremble at the thought of touching it, at another to feel her bending over me, bending so close to see what I was about, that her voice sank low when she spoke to me, and her ribbons brushed my cheek in the wind before she could draw them back. The evenings which followed the sketching excursions of the afternoon varied, rather than checked, these inevitable familiarities. My natural fondness for the music which she played with such tender feeling, such delicate womanly taste, and her natural enjoyment of giving me back, by the practice of her art, the pleasure which I had offered to her by the practice of mine, only wove another tie which drew us closer and closer to one another. The accidents of conversation, the simple habits which regulated even such a little thing as the position of our places at the table, the play of Miss Halcombe's ever-ready raillery, always directed against my anxiety as teacher, while it sparkled over her enthusiasm as pupil. The harmless expression of poor Mrs. Vesey's drowsy approval, which connected Miss Fairley and me as two model young people who never disturbed her. Every one of these trifles, and many more, combined to fold us together in the same domestic atmosphere, and to lead us both insensibly to the same hopeless end. I should have remembered my position, and have put myself secretly on my guard. I did so, but not until it was too late. All the discretion, all the experience, which had availed me with other women, and secured me against other temptations, failed me with her. It had been my profession, for years past, to be this close contact with young girls of all ages and of all orders of beauty. I had accepted the position as part of my calling in life. I had trained myself to leave all the sympathies natural to my age in my employer's outer hall, as coolly as I left my umbrella there before I went upstairs. I had long since learned to understand, composedly and as a matter of course, that my situation in life was considered a guarantee against any of my female pupils feeling more than the most ordinary interest in me, and that I was admitted among beautiful and captivating women, much as a harmless domestic animal is admitted among them. This guardian experience I had gained early. This guardian experience had sternly and strictly guided me straight along my own poor, narrow path, without once letting me stray aside, to the right hand or to the left. And now I and my trusty talisman were parted for the first time. Yes, my hardly earned self-control was as completely lost to me as if I had never possessed it, lost to me as it is lost every day to other men in other critical situations where women are concerned. I know now that I should have questioned myself from the first. I should have asked why any room in the house was better than home to me when she entered it, and barren as a desert when she went out again. Why I always noticed and remembered the little changes in her dress that I had noticed and remembered in no other woman's before. Why I saw her, heard her, and touched her when we shook hands at night and morning, as I had never seen, heard, and touched any other woman in my life. I should have looked into my own heart and found this new growth springing up there, and plucked it out while it was young. Why was this easiest, simplest work of self-culture always too much for me? The explanation has been written already in the 3 words that were enough and plain enough for my confession. I loved her. The days passed. The weeks passed. It was approaching the 3rd month of my stay in Cumberland. The delicious monotony of life in our calm seclusion flowed on with me like a smooth stream with a swimmer who glides down the current. All memory of the past, all thought of the future, all sense of the falseness and hopelessness of my own position lay hushed within me into deceitful rest. Lulled by the siren song that my own heart sang to me, with eyes shut to all sight and ears closed to all sound of danger, I drifted nearer and nearer to the fatal rocks. The warning that aroused me at last, and startled me into sudden, self-accusing consciousness of my own weakness, was the plainest, the truest, the kindest of all warnings, for it came silently from her. We had parted one night as usual. No word had fallen from my lips, at that time or at any time before it, that could betray me or startle her into sudden knowledge of the truth. But when we met again in the morning, a change had come over her, a change that told me all. I shrank then, I shrank still, from invading the innermost sanctuary of her heart and laying it open to others, as I have laid open my own. Let it be enough to say that the time when she first surprised my secret was, I firmly believe, the time when she first surprised her own, and the time also when she changed towards me in the interval of one night. Her nature, too truthful to deceive others, was too noble to deceive itself. When the doubt that I had hushed to sleep first laid its weary weight on her heart, the true face owned all and said, in its own frank, simple language, I am sorry for him. I am sorry for myself. It said this and more, which I could not then interpret. I understood but too well the change in her manner, to greater kindness and quicker readiness than in interpreting all my wishes before others, to constraint and sadness, and nervous anxiety to absorb herself in the first occupation she could seize on, whenever we happened to be left together alone. I understood why the sweet, sensitive lips smiled so rarely and so restrainedly now, why the clear blue eyes looked at me, sometimes with the pity of an angel, sometimes with the innocent perplexity of a child. But the change meant more than this. There was a coldness in her hand. There was an unnatural immobility in her face. There was, in all her movements, the mute expression of constant fear and clinging self-reproach. The sensations that I could trace to herself and to me, the unacknowledged sensations that we were feeling in common, were not these. There were certain elements of the change in her that were still secretly drawing us together, and others that were, as secretly, beginning to drive us apart. In my doubt and perplexity, in my vague suspicion of something hidden, which I was left to find by my own unaided efforts, I examined Miss Halcombe's look and manner for enlightenment. Living in such intimacy as ours, no serious alteration could take place in any one of us which did not sympathetically affect the others. The change in Miss Fairley was reflected in her half-sister. Although not a word escaped Miss Halcombe which hinted at an altered state of feeling toward myself, her penetrating eyes had contracted a new habit of always watching me. Sometimes the look was like suppressed anger, sometimes like suppressed dread, sometimes like neither, like nothing, in short, which I could understand. A week elapsed, leaving us all three still in this position of secret constraint towards one another. My situation, aggravated by the sense of my own miserable weakness and forgetfulness of myself, now too late awakened in me, was becoming intolerable. I felt that I must cast off the oppression under which I was living, at once and forever. Yet how to act for the best, or what to say first, was more than I could tell. From this position of helplessness and humiliation I was rescued by Miss Halcombe. Her lips told me the bitter, the necessary, the unexpected truth. Her hearty kindness sustained me under the shock of hearing it. Her sense and courage turned to its right use, an event which threatened the worst that could happen to me and to others in Limmeridge House. It was on a Thursday in the week, and nearly at the end of the 3rd month of my sojourn in Cumberland. In the morning, when I went down into the breakfast room at the usual hour, Miss Holcombe, for the first time since I had known her, was absent from her customary place at the table. Miss Fairley was out on the lawn. She bowed to me, but did not come in. Not a word had dropped from my lips or from hers that could unsettle either of us, and yet the same unacknowledged sense of embarrassment made us shrink alike from meeting one another alone. She waited on the lawn, and I waited in the breakfast room, till Mrs. Versey or Miss Holcombe came in. How quickly I should have joined her, how readily we should have shaken hands and glided into our customary talk only a fortnight ago. In a few minutes, Miss Holcombe entered. She had a preoccupied look, and she made her apologies for being late rather absently. "I have been detained," she said, "by a consultation with Mr. Fairley on a domestic matter which he wished to speak to me about." Miss Fairley came in from the garden, and the usual morning greeting passed between us. Her hand struck colder to mine than ever. She did not look at me, and she was very pale. Even Mrs. Vesey noticed it when she entered the room a moment after. "Oh, I suppose it is the change in the wind," said the old lady. "The winter is coming. I love the winter is coming soon." In her heart and in mine it had come already. Our morning meal, once so full of pleasant, good-humored discussion of the plans for the day, was short and silent. Miss Fairley seemed to feel the oppression of the long pauses in the conversation, and looked appealingly to her sister to fill them up. Miss Holcombe, after once or twice hesitating and checking herself, in a most uncharacteristic manner, spoke up at last. "I have seen your uncle this morning, Laura," she said. "He thinks the purple room is the one that ought to be got ready, and he confirms what I told you. Monday is the day, not Tuesday." While these words were being spoken, Miss Fairley looked down at the table beneath her. Her fingers moved nervously among the crumbs that were scattered on the cloth. The paleness on her cheek spread to her lips, and the lips themselves trembled visibly. I was not the only person present who noticed this. Miss Holcombe saw it too, and at once set us the example of rising from table. Mrs. Vesey and Miss Fairley left the room together. The kind, sorrowful blue eyes looked at me for a moment with the prescient sadness of a coming and long farewell. I felt the answering pang in my own heart, the pang that told me I must lose her soon, and love her the more unchangeably for the loss. I turned toward the garden, and when the door had closed on her, Miss Holcombe was standing with her hat in her hand and her shawl over her arm by the large window that led out to the lawn, and was looking at me attentively. "Have you any leisure time to spare," she asked, "before you begin to work in your own room?" "Certainly, Miss Holcombe. I have always time at your service." "I want to say a word to you in private, Mr. Hartright. Get your hat and come out into the garden. We're not likely to be disturbed there at this hour in the morning." As we stepped out onto the lawn, one of the under-gardeners, a mere lad, passed us on his way to the house with a letter in his hand. Miss Holcombe stopped him. "Is that letter for me?" she asked. "Nay, miss, it's set to be for Miss Fairley," answered the lad, holding out the letter as he spoke. Miss Holcombe took it from him and looked at the address. "A strange handwriting," she said to herself. "Who can Laura's correspondent be? Where did you get this?" she continued, addressing the gardener. "Well, miss, I just got it from a woman." "What woman?" "A woman well stricken in age." "Oh, an old woman? Anyone you knew?" "I cannot talk on it myself to say that she was other than a stranger to me." "Which way did she go?" "That gate," said the under-gardener, turning with great deliberation towards the south, and embracing the whole part of that part of England with one comprehensive sweep of his arm. "Curious," said Miss Halcombe. "I suppose it must be a begging letter. There," she added, handing the letter back to the lad. "Take it to the house and give it to one of the servants. And now, Mr. Hartright, if you have no objection, let us walk this way." She led me across the lawn, along the same path by which I had followed her on the day after my arrival at Limmeridge. At the little summer house in which Laura Fairley and I had first seen each other, she stopped and broke the silence which she had steadily maintained while we were walking together. "What I have to say to you, I can say here." With those words, she entered the summer house, took one of the chairs at the little round table inside, and signed to me to take the other. I suspected what was coming when she spoke to me in the breakfast room. I felt certain of it now. "Mr. Hartright," she said, "I'm going to begin by making a frank avowal to you. I'm going to say, without phrase-making, which I detest, or paying compliments, which I heartily despise, that I have come in the course of your residence with us to feel a strong friendly regard for you. I was predisposed in your favor when you first told me of your conduct toward that unhappy woman whom you met under such remarkable circumstances. Your management of the affair might not have been prudent, but it showed the self-control, the delicacy, and the compassion of a man who is naturally a gentleman. It made me expect good things from you, and you have not disappointed my expectations." She paused, but held her hand up at the same time, as a sign that she awaited no answer from me before she proceeded. "When I entered the summer house, no thought was in me of the woman in white. But now Miss Halcombe's own words had put that memory of my adventure back in my mind. It remained there throughout the interview. Remained, and not without a result. As your friend," she proceeded, "I am going to tell you, at once, in my own plain, blunt, downright language, that I have discovered your secret, without help or hint, mind, from anyone else. Mr. Hartright, you have thoughtlessly allowed yourself to form an attachment, a serious and devoted attachment, I am afraid, to my sister Laura. I don't put you to the pain of confessing it in so many words, because I see and know that you are too honest to deny it. I don't even blame you. I pity you for opening your heart to a hopeless affection. You have not attempted to take any underhanded advantage. You have not spoken to my sister in secret. You are guilty of weakness and want of attention to your own best interests, but of nothing worse. If you had acted, in any single respect, less delicately and less modestly, I should have told you to leave the house without an instant's notice, or an instant's consultation of anybody. As it is, I blame the misfortune of your years and your position. I don't blame you. Shake hands. I have given you pain. I am going to give you more, but there is no help for it. Shake hands with your friend Marian Halcombe first." The sudden kindness, the warm, high-minded, fearless sympathy which met me on such mercifully equal terms, which appealed with such delicate and generous abruptness straight to my heart, my honor, and my courage, overcame me in an instant. I tried to look at her. When she took my hand, but my eyes were dim. I tried to thank her, but my voice failed me. "Listen to me," she said, considerately avoiding all notice of my loss of self-control. "Listen to me, and let us get it over at once. It is a real, true relief to me that I am not obliged, in what I have now to say, to enter into the question, the hard and cruel question, as I think it, of social inequalities. Circumstances which will try you to the quick spare me the ungracious necessity of paining a man who has lived in friendly intimacy under the same roof with myself by any humiliating reference to matters of rank and station. You must leave Limmeridge House, Mr. Hartright, before any more harm is done. It is my duty to say that to you, and it would be equally my duty to say it under precisely the same serious necessity if you were the representative of the oldest and wealthiest family in England. You must leave us, not because you are a teacher of drawing." She waited a moment, turned her face full on me, and, reaching across the table, laid her hand firmly on my arm. "Not because you are a teacher of drawing," she repeated, "but because Laura Fairley is engaged to be married." The last word went like a bullet to my heart. My arm lost all sensation of the hand that grasped it. I never moved and never spoke. The sharp autumn breeze that scattered the dead leaves at our feet came as cold to me, on a sudden, as if my own mad hopes were dead leaves too, whirled away by the wind like the rest. Hopes. Betrothed or not betrothed, she was equally far from me. Would other men have remembered that in my place? Not if they had loved her as I did. The pang passed, and nothing but the dull, numbing pain of it remained. I felt Miss Halcombe's hand again, tightening its hold on my arm. I raised my head and looked at her. Her large black eyes were rooted on me, watching the white change on my face, which I felt and which she saw. "Crush it," she said. "Here, where you first saw her, crush it. Don't shrink under it like a woman. Tear it out, trample it underfoot like a man." The suppressed vehemence with which she spoke, the strength which her will, concentrated in the look she fixed on me, and in the hold on my arm that she had not yet relinquished, communicated to mine, steadied me. We both waited for a minute in silence. At the end of that time, I had justified her generous faith in my manhood. I had, outwardly at least, recovered my self-control. "Are you yourself again?" "Enough myself, Miss Halcombe, to ask your pardon and hers. Enough myself to be guided by your advice and to prove my gratitude in that way, if I can prove it in no other." "You have proved it already," she answered, "by those words. Mr. Hartright, concealment is at an end between us. I cannot affect to hide from you what my sister has unconsciously shown to me. You must leave us for her sake, as well as for your own. Your presence here, your necessary intimacy with us, harmless as it has been, God knows, in all other respects, has unsteadied her and made her wretched. I, who love her better than my own life, I have learnt to believe that pure, noble, innocent nature, as I believe in my religion, know but too well the secret misery of self-reproach that she has been suffering since the first shadow of a feeling disloyal to her marriage engagement entered her heart in spite of her. I don't say it. It would be useless to attempt to say it after what has happened, that her engagement has ever had a strong hold on her affections. It is an engagement of honor, not love. Her father sanctioned it on his deathbed 2 years since. She herself neither welcomed it nor shrank from it. She was content to make it. Till you came here, she was in the position of hundreds of other women who marry men without being greatly attracted to them or greatly repelled by them, and who learn to love them, when they don't learn to hate, after marriage instead of before. I hope more earnestly than words can say, and you should have the self-sacrificing courage to hope too, that the new thoughts and feelings which have disturbed the old calmness and the old content have not taken root too deeply to be ever removed. Your absence, if I had less belief in your honor and your courage and your sense, I should not trust to them as I am trusting now. Your absence will help my efforts, and time will help us all three. It is something to know that my first confidence in you was not all misplaced. It is something to know that you will not be less honest, less manly, less considerate toward the pupil whose relation to yourself you have had the misfortune to forget, than towards the stranger and the outcast whose appeal to you was not made in vain. Again, the chance reference to the woman in white. Was there no possibility of speaking of Miss Fairley and of me without raising the memory of Anne Catherick and setting her between us, like a fatality that was hopeless to avoid? Tell me what apology I can make to Mr. Fairley for breaking my engagement, I said. "Tell me when to go after that apology is accepted. I promise implicit obedience to you and to your advice." "Time is in every way of importance," she answered. "You heard me refer this morning to Monday next, and to the necessity of setting the Purple Room in order. The visitor whom we expect on Monday." I could not wait for her to be more explicit. Knowing what I knew now, the memory of Miss Fairley's look and manner at the breakfast table told me that the expected visitor at Limmeridge House was her future husband. I tried to force it back, but something rose within me at that moment, stronger than my own will, and I interrupted Miss Halcombe. "Let me go today," I said bitterly. "The sooner the better." "No, not today. The only reason you can assign to Mr. Fairley for your departure before the end of your engagement must be that an unforeseen necessity compels you to ask his permission to return at once to London. You must wait till tomorrow to tell him that, at the time when the post comes in, because you will then understand the sudden change in your plans by associating it with the arrival of a letter from London. It is miserable and sickening to descend to deceit, even of the most harmless kind, but I know Mr. Fairley, and if you once excite his suspicions that you are trifling with him, he will refuse to release you. Speak to him on Friday morning. Occupy yourself afterwards, for the sake of your own interests with your employer, and leaving your unfinished work in as little confusion as possible, and quit this place on Saturday. It will be time enough then, Mr. Hartright, for you and for all of us." Before I could assure her that she might depend on my acting in the strictest accordance with her wishes, we were both startled by advancing footsteps in the shrubbery. Someone was coming from the house to seek for us. I felt the blood rush into my cheeks and then leave them again. Could the third person who was fast approaching us at such a time and under such circumstances be Miss Fairley? It was a relief. So sadly, so hopelessly was my position towards her changed already. It was absolutely a relief to me when the person who had disturbed us appeared at the entrance of the summer house and proved to only be Miss Fairley's maid. "Could I speak to you for a moment, miss?" said the girl in rather a flurried, unsettled manner. Miss Halcombe descended the steps into the shrubbery and walked aside a few paces with the maid. Left by myself, my mind reverted with a sense of forlorn wretchedness, which is not in any words that I can find to describe, to my approaching return to the solitude and the despair of my lonely London home. Thoughts of my kind old mother and of my sister, who had rejoiced with her so innocently over my prospects in Cumberland, thoughts whose long banishment from my heart it was now my shame and my reproach to realize for the first time, came back to me with the loving mournfulness of old neglected friends. My mother and my sister, what would they feel when I returned to them from my broken engagement with the confession of my miserable secret? They who had parted from me so hopefully on that last happy night in the Hampstead cottage. And Catherick again. Even the memory of the farewell evening with my mother and my sister could not return to me now unconnected with that other memory of the moonlight walk back to London. What did it mean? Were that woman and I to meet once more? It was possible at the least. Did she know that I lived in London? Yes, I had told her so, either before or after the strange question of hers, when she had asked me so distrustfully if I knew many men of the rank of baronet. Either before or after, my mind was not calm enough then to remember which. A few moments elapsed before Miss Halcombe dismissed the maid and came back to me. She too looked flurried and unsettled. "We have arranged all that is necessary, Mr. Hartright," she said. "We have understood each other as friends should, and we may go back at once to the house. To tell you the truth, I am uneasy about Laura. She has sent to say that she wants to see me directly, and the maid reports that her mistress is apparently very much agitated by a letter that she has received this morning. The same letter, no doubt, which I sent on to the house before we came here. We retraced our steps together hastily along the shrubbery path. Although Miss Halcombe had ended all that she thought it necessary to say on her side, I had not ended all that I wanted to say on mine. From the moment when I had discovered that the expected visitor at Limmeridge was Miss Fairlie's future husband, I had felt a bitter curiosity, a burning, envious eagerness to know who he was. It was possible that a future opportunity of putting the question might not easily offer, so I risked asking it on our way back to the house. "Now that you are kind enough to tell me that we have understood each other, Miss Halcombe," I said, "now that you are sure of my gratitude for your forbearance and my obedience to your wishes, may I venture to ask who?" I hesitated. I had forced myself to think of him, but it was harder still to speak of him as her promised husband. "Who the gentleman engaged to Miss Fairlie is?" Her mind was evidently occupied with the message that she had received from her sister. She answered in a hasty, absent way, "A gentleman of large property in Hampshire." Hampshire, Anne Catherick's native place. Again, and yet again, the woman in white. There was a fatality in it. "And his name?" I said, as quietly and as differently as I could. "Sir Percival Glyde." Sir Percival? Anne Catherick's question, that suspicious question about the men of the rank of baronet whom I might happen to know, had hardly been dismissed from my mind by Miss Halcombe's return to me in the summer house before it was recalled again by her own answer. I stopped suddenly and looked at her. "Sir Percival Glyde," she repeated, imagining that I had not heard her former reply. "Knight or baronet?" I asked, with an agitation that I could hide no longer. She paused for a moment, then answered rather coldly, "Baronet, of course." Not a word more was said on either side as we walked back to the house. Miss Halcombe hastened immediately to her sister's room, and I withdrew to my studio to set in order all of Mr. Fairlie's drawings that I had not yet mounted and restored before I resigned them to the care of other hands. Thoughts that I had hitherto restrained, thoughts that made my position harder than ever to endure, crowded on me now that I was alone. She was engaged to be married, and her future husband was Sir Percival Glyde, a man of the rank of baronet and the owner of property in Hampshire. There were hundreds of baronets in England, and dozens of landowners in Hampshire. Judging by the ordinary rules of evidence, I had not the shadow of a reason thus far for connecting Sir Percival Glyde with the suspicious words of inquiry that had been spoken to me by the woman in white. And yet, I did connect him with them. Was it because he had now become associated in my mind with Miss Fairlie? Miss Fairlie being in her turn associated with Anne Catherick, since the night when I had discovered the ominous likeness between them. Had the events of the morning so unnerved me already that I was at the mercy of any delusion which common chances and common coincidences might suggest to my imagination? Impossible to say. I could only feel that what had passed between Miss Halcombe and myself on our way from the summer house had affected me very strangely. The foreboding of some undiscoverable danger lying hid from us all in the darkness of the future was strong on me. The doubt whether I was not linked already to a chain of events which even my approaching departure from Cumberland would be powerless to snap asunder. The doubt whether we any of us saw the end as the end would really be gathered more and more darkly over my mind. Poignant as it was, the sense of suffering caused by the miserable end of my brief, presumptuous love seemed to be blunted and deadened still by the stronger sense of something obscurely impending, something invisibly threatening, that time was holding over our heads. I I had been engaged with the drawings little more than half an hour when there was a knock at the door. It opened on my answering, and to my surprise, Miss Holcomb entered the room. Her manner was angry and agitated. She caught up a chair for herself before I could give her one and sat down in it close at my side. "Mr. Hartright," she'd said, "I had hoped that all painful subjects of conversation were exhausted between us, for today at least. But it is not to be so. There is some underhand villainy at work to frighten my sister about her approaching marriage. You saw me send the gardener on to the house with a letter addressed in strange handwriting to Miss Fairley." "Certainly." "The letter is an anonymous letter, a vile attempt to injure Sir Percival Glyde in my sister's estimation. It has so agitated and alarmed her that I have had the greatest possible difficulty in composing her spirit sufficiently to allow me to leave her room and come here. I know this is a family matter on which I ought not to consult you, and in which you can feel no concern or interest. I beg your pardon, Miss Holcomb. I feel the strongest possible concern and interest in anything that affects Miss Fairley's happiness or yours." "I am glad to hear you say so. You are the only person in the house or out of it who can advise me. Mr. Fairley, in his state of health and with his horror of difficulties and mysteries of all kinds, is not to be thought of. The clergyman is a good, weak man who knows nothing out of the routine of his duties, and our neighbors are just the sort of comfortable, jog-trot acquaintances whom one cannot disturb in times of trouble and danger. What I want to know is this: ought I, at once, to take steps such as I can to discover the writer of the letter, or ought I to wait and apply to Mr. Fairley's legal adviser tomorrow? It is a question, perhaps a very important one, of gaining or losing a day. Tell me what you think, Mr. Hartright. If necessity had not already obliged me to take you into my confidence under very delicate circumstances, even my helpless situation would, perhaps, be no excuse for me. But, as things are, I cannot surely be wrong, after all that has passed between us, and forgetting that you are a friend of only 3 months' standing." She gave me the letter. It began abruptly, without any preliminary form of address, as follows: "Do you believe in dreams? I hope for your own sake that you do. See what Scripture says about dreams and their fulfillment. Genesis, chapters 8, verse 25. Daniel, chapter 5, verses 18 through 25. And take the warning I send you before it is too late. Last night I dreamed about you, Miss Fairley. I dreamed that I was standing inside the communion rails of a church, I on one side of the altar table, and the clergyman with his surplice and prayer book on the other. After a time, there walked towards us down the aisle of the church a man and a woman coming to be married. You were the woman. You looked so pretty and innocent in your beautiful white silk dress and your long white lace veil that my heart felt for you, and tears came into my eyes. They were tears of pity, young lady, that heaven blesses, and instead of falling from my eyes like the everyday tears that we all of us shed, they turned into 2 rays of light which slanted nearer and nearer to the man standing at the altar with you till they touched his breast. The 2 rays sprang in arches like 2 rainbows between me and him. I looked along them, and I saw down into his innermost heart. The outside of the man you were marrying was fair enough to see. He was neither tall nor short. He was a little below the middle size, a light, active, high-spirited man, about 45 years old to look at. He had a pale face and was bald over the forehead, but had dark hair on the rest of his head. His beard was shaven on his chin, but was let to grow, of a fine rich brown, on his cheeks and his upper lips. His eyes were brown too, and very bright, his nose straight and handsome and delicate enough to have done for a woman's, his hands the same. He was troubled from time to time with a dry hacking cough, and when he put up his white right hand to his mouth, he showed the red scar of an old wound across the back of it. Have I dreamt of the right man? You know best, Miss Fairley, and you can say if I was deceived or not. Read next what I saw beneath the outside. I entreat you, read and profit. I looked along the 2 rays of light, and I saw down into his innermost heart. It was black as night, and on it were written in the red flaming letters which are the handwriting of the fallen angel, without pity and without remorse. He has strewn with misery the paths of others, and he will live to strew with misery the path of this woman by his side. I read that, and then the rays of the light shifted and pointed over his shoulder, and there behind him stood a fiend laughing. And the rays of light shifted once more and pointed over your shoulder, and there behind you stood an angel weeping. And the rays of light shifted for the 3rd time and pointed straight between you and that man. They widened and widened, thrusting you both asunder, one from the other. And the clergyman looked for the marriage service in vain. It was gone out of the book. And he shut up the leaves and put it from him in despair. And I woke with my eyes full of tears and my heart beating, for I believe in dreams. Believe too, Miss Fairley, I beg of you, for your own sake, believe as I do. Joseph and Daniel and others in scriptures believed in dreams. Inquire into the past life of that man with the scar in his hand before you say the words that make you his miserable wife. I don't give you this warning on my account, but on yours. I have an interest in your well-being that will live as long as I draw breath. Your mother's daughter has a tender place in my heart, for your mother was my first, my best, my only friend. There, the extraordinary letter ended, without signature of any sort. The handwriting afforded no prospect of a clue. It was traced on ruled lines, in the cramped conventional copybook character technically termed small hand. It was feeble and faint and defaced by blots, but had otherwise nothing to distinguish it. That is not an illiterate letter, said Miss Halcombe, and at the same time it is surely too incoherent to be the letter of an educated person in the higher ranks of life. The reference to the bridal dress and veil and other little expressions seem to point to it as the production of some woman. What do you think, Mr. Hartright? I think so too. It seems to me to be not only the letter of a woman, but of a woman whose mind must be deranged, suggested Miss Halcombe. It struck me in that light too. I did not answer. While I was speaking, my eyes rested on the last sentence of the letter. Your mother's daughter has a tender place in my heart, for your mother was my first, my best, my only friend. Those words and the doubt which had just escaped me as to the sanity of the writer of the letter, acting together on my mind, suggested an idea which I was literally afraid to express openly, or even to encourage secretly. I began to doubt whether my own faculties were not in danger of losing their balance. It seemed almost like a monomania to be tracing back everything strange that happened, everything unexpected that was said, always to the same hidden source and the same sinister influence. I resolved this time, in defense of my own courage and my own sense, to come to no decision that plain fact did not warrant, and to turn my back resolutely on everything that tempted me in the shape of a surmise. "If we have any chance of tracing the person who has written this," I said, returning the letter to Miss Halcombe, "there can be no harm in seizing our opportunity the moment it offers. I think we ought to speak to the gardener again about the elderly woman who gave him the letter, and then to continue our inquiries in the village. But first, let me ask a question. You mentioned just now the alternative of consulting Mr. Fairley's legal advisor tomorrow. Is there no possibility of communicating with him earlier? Why not today?" "I can only explain," replied Miss Halcombe, "by entering into certain particulars connected with my sister's marriage engagement, which I did not think it necessary or desirable to mention to you this morning. One of Sir Percival Glyde's objects in coming here on Monday is to fix the period of his marriage, which has been hitherto left quite unsettled. He is anxious that the event should take place before the end of the year." "Does Miss Fairley know of that wish?" I asked eagerly. "She has no suspicion of it, and after what has happened, I shall not take the responsibility upon myself of enlightening her. Sir Percival has only mentioned his views to Mr. Fairley, who has told me himself that he is ready and anxious, as Laura's guardian, to forward them. He has written to London to the family solicitor, Mr. Gilmore. Mr. Gilmore happens to be away in Glasgow on business, and he has replied by proposing to stop at Limmeridge House on his way back to town. He will arrive tomorrow, and will stay with us a few days, so as to allow Sir Percival time to plead his own cause. If he succeeds, Mr. Gilmore will then return to London, taking with him his instructions for my sister's marriage settlement. You understand now, Mr. Hartright, why I speak of waiting to take legal advice until tomorrow? Mr. Gilmore is the old and tried friend of 2 generations of Fairleys, and we can trust him as we could trust no one else." The marriage settlement. The mere hearing of those 2 words stung me with a jealous despair that was poison to my higher and better instincts. I began to think, to end of the terrible story that I now stand committed to reveal, I began to think with a hateful eagerness of hope of the vague charges of Sir Percival Glyde which the anonymous letter contained. What if those wild accusations rested on a foundation of truth? What if their truth could be proved before the fatal words of consent were spoken and the marriage settlement was drawn? I have tried to think since that the feeling which then animated me began and ended in pure devotion to Miss Fairley's interests. But I have never succeeded in deceiving myself into believing it, and I must not now attempt to deceive others. The feeling began and ended in reckless, vindictive, hopeless hatred of the man who was to marry her. "If we are to find out anything," I said, speaking under the new influence which was now directing me, "we had better not let another minute slip by us unemployed. I can only suggest once more the propriety of questioning the gardener a second time and of inquiring in the village immediately afterwards." "I think I may be of help to you in both cases," said Miss Halcombe, rising. "Let us go, Mr. Hartright, at once, and do the best we can together." I had the door in my hand to open it for her, but I stopped on a sudden to ask an important question before we set forth. "One of the paragraphs of the anonymous letter," I said, "contains some sentences of minute personal description. Sir Percival Glyde's name is not mentioned, I know, but does that description at all resemble him?" "Accurately, even in stating his age to be 45. 45, and she was not yet 21. Men of his age married wives of her age every day, and experience had shown those marriages to often be the happiest ones. I knew that, and yet even the mention of his age, when I contrasted it with hers, added to my blind hatred and distrust of him. "Accurately," Miss Halcombe continued, "even to the scar on his right hand, which is the scar of a wound that he received years since when he was traveling in Italy. There can be no doubt that every peculiarity of his personal appearance is thoroughly well known to the writer of the letter. Even a cough that he is troubled with is mentioned, if I remember right. Yes, and mentioned correctly. He treats it lightly himself, though it sometimes makes his friends anxious about him. I suppose no whispers have ever been heard against his character. Mr. Hartright, I hope you're not unjust enough to let that infamous letter influence you. I felt the blood rush into my cheeks, for I knew that it had influenced me. I hope not, I answered confusedly. Perhaps I had no right to ask the question. I'm not sorry you asked it, for it enables me to do justice to Sir Percival's reputation. Not a whisper, Mr. Hartright, has ever reached me or my family against him. He has fought successfully 2 contested elections and has come out of the ordeal unscathed. A man who can do that in England is a man whose character is established. I opened the door for her in silence and followed her out. She had not convinced me. If the recording angel had come down from heaven to confirm her and had opened his book to my mortal eyes, the recording angel would not have convinced me. We found the gardener at work as usual. No amount of questioning could extract a single answer of any importance from the lad's impenetrable stupidity. The woman who had given him the letter was an elderly woman. She had not spoken a word to him, and she had gone away towards the south in a great hurry. That was all the gardener could tell us. The village lay southward of the house, so to the village we went next. And I'm just going to take a brief break quick. Our inquiries at Limmeridge were patiently pursued in all directions and among all sorts and conditions of people, but nothing came of them. 3 of the villagers did certainly assure us that they had seen the woman, but as they were quite unable to describe her and quite incapable of agreeing about the exact direction in which she was proceeding when they last saw her, these 3 bright exceptions to the general rule of total ignorance afforded no more real assistance to us than the mass of their unhelpful and unobservant neighbors. The course of our useless investigations brought us, in time, to the end of the village at which the schools established by Mrs. Fairley were situated. As we passed the side of the building appropriated to the use of the boys, I suggested the propriety of making a last inquiry of the schoolmaster, whom we might presume to be, in virtue of his office, the most intelligent man in the place. I am afraid the schoolmaster must have been occupied with his scholars, said Miss Holcombe, just at the time when the woman passed through the village and returned again. However, we can but try. We entered the playground enclosure and walked by the schoolroom window to get round to the door, which was situated at the back of the building. I stopped for a moment at the window and looked in. The schoolmaster was sitting at his high desk with his back to me, apparently haranguing the pupils, who were all gathered together in front of him with one exception. The one exception was a sturdy, white-headed boy, standing apart from all the rest on a stool in a corner, a forlorn little Crusoe, isolated in his own desert island of solitary penal disgrace. The door, when we got round to it, was ajar, and the schoolmaster's voice reached us plainly, as we both stopped for a minute under the porch. "Now, boys," said the voice, "mind what I tell you. If I hear another word spoken about ghosts in this school, it will be the worst for all of you. There are no such things as ghosts, and therefore any boy who believes in ghosts believes in what can't possibly be, and a boy who belongs to Limmeridge School and believes in what can't possibly be sets up his back against reason and discipline and must be punished accordingly. You all see Jacob Postlethwaite standing up on the stool there in disgrace. He has been punished, not because he saw a ghost last night, but because he is too impudent and too obstinate to listen to reason, and because he persists in saying he saw the ghost after I have told him that no such thing can possibly be. Quiet. If nothing else will do, I mean to cane the ghost out of Jacob Postlethwaite, and if the thing spreads among any of the rest of you, I mean to go a step further and cane the ghost out of the whole school. We seem to have chosen an awkward moment for our visit, said Miss Holcomb, pushing open the door at the end of the schoolmaster's address and leading the way in. Our appearance produced a strong sensation among the boys. They appeared to think that we had arrived for the express purpose of seeing Jacob Postlethwaite caned. "Go home, all of you, to dinner," said the schoolmaster, "except Jacob. Jacob must stop where he is, and the ghost may bring him his dinner if the ghost pleases." Jacob's fortitude deserted him at the double disappearance of his schoolfellows and his prospect of dinner. He took his hands out of his pockets, looked hard at his knuckles, raised them with great deliberation to his eyes, and when they got there, ground them round and round slowly, accompanying the action by short spasms of sniffing, which followed each other at regular intervals, the nasal minute guns of juvenile distress. "We came here to ask you a question, Mr. Dempster," said Miss Holcomb, addressing the schoolmaster, "and we little expected to find you occupied in exorcising a ghost. What does it all mean? What has really happened?" "That wicked boy has been frightening the whole school, Miss Holcomb, by declaring that he saw a ghost yesterday evening," answered the master. "And he still persists in his absurd story, in spite of all that I can say to him." "Most extraordinary," said Miss Holcomb. "I should not have thought it possible that any of the boys had imagination enough to see a ghost. This is a new accession indeed to the hard labor of forming the youthful mind at Limmeridge, and I heartily wish you well through it, Mr. Dempster. In the meantime, let me explain why you see me here and what it is that I want." She then put the same question to the schoolmaster which we had asked already of almost everyone else in the village. It was met by the same discouraging answer. Mr. Dempster had not set eyes on the stranger of whom we were in search. "We may as well return to the house, Mr. Hartright," said Miss Holcomb. "The information we want is evidently not to be found." She had bowed to Mr. Dempster and was about to leave the schoolroom when the forlorn position of Jacob Postlethwaite, piteously sniffing on the stool of penitence, attracted her attention as she passed him, and made her stop good-humoredly to speak a word into the little prisoner before she opened the door. "You foolish boy, why don't you beg Mr. Dempster's pardon and hold your tongue about the ghost?" "But I saw a ghost," persisted Jacob Postlethwaite, with a stare of terror and a burst of tears. "Stuff and nonsense, you saw nothing of the kind. Ghost indeed. What ghost?" "I beg your pardon, Miss Holcomb," interpreted the schoolmaster a little uneasily, "but I think you had better not question the boy. The obstinate folly of his story is beyond all belief, and you might lead him to ignorantly—" "Ignorantly what?" inquired Miss Holcomb sharply. "Ignorantly shocking your feelings," said Mr. Dempster, looking very much decomposed. "Upon my word, Mr. Dempster, you pay my feelings a great compliment in thinking them weak enough to be shocked by such an urchin as that." She turned with an air of satirical defiance to little Jacob and began to question him directly. "Come," she said, "I mean to know all about this. You naughty boy, when did you see the ghost?" "Yestreen, at the gloaming," replied Jacob. Oh, so you saw it yesterday evening in the twilight. And what was it like? All in white, as a ghost should be, answered the ghost seer with a confidence beyond his years. And where was it? Away yonder in the kirkyard, where a ghost ought to be. As a guest should be, where a ghost ought to be. Why, you little fool, you talk as if the manners and customs of ghosts had been familiar to you from your infancy. You've got your story at your fingers' ends, at any rate. I suppose I shall hear next that you can actually tell me whose ghost it was? But I just can, replied Jacob, nodding his head with an air of gloomy triumph. Mr. Dempster had already tried several times to speak while Miss Halcombe was examining his pupil, and he now interposed resolutely enough to make himself heard. Excuse me, Miss Halcombe, he said, if I venture to say that you are only encouraging the boy by asking him these questions. I will merely ask one more, Mr. Dempster, and then I shall be quite satisfied. Well, she continued, turning to the boy, and whose ghost was it? The ghost of Mistress Fairlie, answered Jacob in a whisper. The effect which this extraordinary reply produced on Miss Halcombe fully justified the anxiety which the schoolmaster had shown to prevent her from hearing it. Her face crimsoned with indignation. She turned upon little Jacob with an angry suddenness which terrified him into a fresh burst of tears, opened her lips to speak to him, then controlled herself and addressed the master instead of the boy. It is useless, she said, to hold such a child as that responsible for what he says. I have little doubt that the idea has been put into his head by others. If there are people in this village, Mr. Dempster, who have forgotten the respect and gratitude due from every soul in it to my mother's memory, I will find them out, and if I have any influence with Mr. Fairlie, they shall suffer for it. I hope, and indeed I am sure, Miss Halcombe, that you are mistaken, said the schoolmaster. The matter begins and ends with the boy's own perversity and folly. He saw, or thought he saw, a woman in white yesterday evening as he was passing the churchyard, and the figure, real or fancied, was standing by the marble cross, which he and everyone else in Limmeridge knows to be the monument over Mrs. Fairlie's grave. These two circumstances are surely sufficient to have suggested to the boy himself the answer which has so naturally shocked you. Although Miss Halcombe did not seem to be convinced, she evidently felt that the schoolmaster's statement of the case was too sensible to be openly combated. She merely replied by thanking him for his attention and by promising to see him again when her doubts were satisfied. This said, she bowed and led the way out of the schoolroom. Throughout the whole of this strange scene, I had stood apart, listening attentively and drawing my own conclusions. As soon as we were alone again, Miss Halcombe asked me if I had formed any opinion on what I had heard. A very strong opinion, I answered. The boy's story, as I believe, has a foundation in fact. I confess I am anxious to see the monument over Mrs. Fairlie's grave and to examine the ground around it. You shall see the grave. She paused after making that reply and reflected a little as we walked on. What has happened in the schoolroom, she resumed, has so completely distracted my attention from the subject of the letter that I feel a little bewildered when I try to return to it. Must we give up all idea of making further inquiries and wait to place the thing in Mr. Gilmore's hands tomorrow? Winston. By no means, Miss Halcombe. What has happened in the schoolroom encourages me to persevere in the investigation. Why does it encourage you? Because it strengthens a suspicion I felt when you gave me the letter to read. I suppose you had your reasons, Mr. Hartright, for concealing that suspicion from me till this moment? I was afraid to encourage it in myself. I thought it was utterly preposterous. I distrusted it as the result of some perversity in my own imagination, but I can do so no longer. Not only the boy's own answers to your questions, but even the chance expression of that dropped from the schoolmaster's lips in explaining his story have forced the idea back into my mind. Events may yet prove that the idea to be a delusion, Miss Holcomb, but the belief is strong in me at this moment that the fancied ghost in the churchyard and the writer of the letter are one and the same person. She stopped, turned pale, and looked me eagerly in the face. What person? The schoolmaster unconsciously told you, when he spoke of the figure that the boy saw in the churchyard. He called it a woman in white. Not Aunt Catherick. Yes, Aunt Catherick. She put her hand through my arm and leaned on it heavily. I don't know why, she said in low tones, but there is something in the suspicion of yours that seems to startle and unnerve me. I feel... She stopped and tried to laugh it off. Mr. Hartright, she went on, I will show you the grave and then go back at once to the house. I'd better not leave Laura too long alone. I'd better go back and sit with her. We were close to the churchyard when she spoke. The church, a dreary building of grey stone, was situated in a little valley, so as to be sheltered from the bleak winds blowing over the moorland all round it. The burial ground advanced from the side of the church a little way up the slope of the hill. It was surrounded by a rough, low stone wall, and was bare and open to the sky, except at one extremity where the brook trickled down the stony hillside, and a clump of dwarf trees threw their narrow shoulders over the short, meager grass. Just beyond the brook and the trees, and not far from one of the 3 stone stiles which afforded entrance at various points to the churchyard, rose the white marble cross that distinguished Mrs. Fairley's grave from the humbler monuments scattered about it. I need go no further with you, said Miss Holcomb, pointing to the grave. You will let me know if you find anything to confirm the idea you have just mentioned to me. Let us meet again at the house. She left me. I descended at once to the churchyard and crossed the stile which led directly to Mrs. Fairley's grave. The grass about it was too short and the ground too hard to show any marks of footsteps. Disappointed thus far, I next looked attentively at the cross, and at the square block of marble below it, on which the inscription was cut. The natural whiteness of the cross was a little clouded here and there by weather stains, and rather more than 1/2 of the square block beneath it, on the side which bore the inscription, was in the same condition. The other half, however, attracted my attention at once by its singular freedom from stain or impurity of any kind. I looked closer and saw that it had been cleaned, recently cleaned in the downward direction from top to bottom. The boundary line between the part that had been cleaned and the part that had not was traceable wherever the inscription left a blank space of marble, sharply traceable as a line that had been produced by artificial means. Who had begun the cleansing of the marble and who had left it unfinished? I looked about me, wondering how the question was to be solved. No sign of a habitation could be discerned from the point at which I was standing. The burial ground was left in the lonely possession of the dead. I returned to the church and walked round till I came to the back of the building, and then crossed the boundary wall beyond by another of the stone stiles, and found myself at the head of a path leading down into a deserted stone quarry. Against one side of the quarry a little 2-room cottage was built, and just outside the door an old woman was engaged in washing. I walked up to her and entered into her conversation about the church and burial ground. She was ready enough to talk, and almost the first words she said informed me that her husband filled 2 of the offices of clerk and sexton. I said a few words next in praise of Mrs. Fairley's monument. The old woman shook her head and told me I had not seen it at its best. It was her husband's business to look after it, but he had been so ailing and weak for months and months past that he had hardly been able to crawl into church on Sundays to do his duty, and the monument had been neglected in consequence. He was getting a little better now, and in a week or 10 days' time, he hoped to be strong enough to set to work and clean it. This information, extracted from a long, rambling answer in the broadest Cumberland dialect, told me that I most wanted to know. I gave the poor woman a trifle and returned at once to Limmeridge House. The partial cleansing of the monument had evidently been accomplished by a strange hand. Connecting what I had discovered thus far with what I had suspected after hearing the story of the ghost seen at twilight, I wanted nothing more to confirm my resolution to watch Mrs. Fairley's grave in secret that evening, returning to it at sunset and waiting within sight of it till the night fell. The work of cleansing the monument had been left unfinished, and the person by whom it had been begun might return to complete it. On getting back to the house, I informed Miss Holcombe of what I intended to do. She looked surprised and uneasy while I was explaining my purpose, but she made no positive objection to the execution of it. She only said, "I hope it may end well." Just as she was leaving me again, I stopped her to inquire, as calmly as I could, after Miss Fairley's health. She was in better spirits, and Miss Holcombe hoped she might be induced to take a little walking exercise while the afternoon sun lasted. I returned to my own room to resume setting the drawings in order. It was necessary to do this, and doubly necessary to keep my mind employed on anything that would help to distract my attention from myself and from the hopeless future that lay before me. From time to time, I paused in my work to look out of the window and watch the sky as the sun sank nearer and nearer to the horizon. On one of those occasions, I saw a figure on the broad gravel walk under my window. It was Miss Fairley. I had not seen her since the morning, and I had hardly spoken to her then. Another day at Limmeridge was all that remained to me, and after that day my eyes might never look on her again. This thought was enough to hold me at the window. I had sufficient consideration for her to arrange the blinds so that she might not see me if she looked up, but I had no strength to resist the temptation of letting my eye at least follow her as far as they could on her walk. She was dressed in a brown cloak, with a plain black silk gown under it. On her head was the same simple straw hat which she had worn on the morning when we first met. A veil was attached to it now which hid her face from me. By her side trotted a little Italian greyhound, the pet companion of all her walks, smartly dressed in a scarlet cloth wrapper to keep the sharp air from his delicate skin. She did not seem to notice the dog. She walked straight forward with her head drooping a little and her arms folded in her cloak. The dead leaves, which had whirled in the wind before me when I had heard of her marriage engagement in the morning, whirled in the wind before her, and rose and fell and scattered themselves at her feet as she walked on in the pale, waning sunlight. The dog shivered and trembled and pressed against her dress impatiently for notice and encouragement, but she never heeded him. She walked on, farther and farther away from me, with the dead leaves whirling about her on the path, walked on, till my aching eyes could see her no more, and I was left alone again with my own heavy heart. In another hour's time I had done my work, and the sunset was at hand. I got my hat and coat in the hall and slipped out of the house without meeting anyone. The clouds were wild in the western heaven, and the wind blew chill from the sea. Far as the shore was, the sound of the surf swept over the intervening moorland, and beat drearily in my ears when I entered the churchyard. Not a living creature was in sight. The place looked lonelier than ever, as I chose my position and waited and watched, with my eyes on the white cross that rose over Mrs. Fairley's grave. The exposed situation of the churchyard had obliged me to be cautious in choosing the position that I was to occupy. The main entrance to the church was on the side next to the burial ground, and the door was screened by a porch walled in on either side. After some little hesitation, caused by natural reluctance to conceal myself, indispensable as that concealment was to the object in view, I had resolved on entering the porch. A loophole window was pierced on either of its side walls. Through one of these windows I could see Mrs. Fairley's grave. The other looked toward the stone quarry in which the sexton's cottage was built. Before me, fronting the porch entrance, was a patch of bare burial ground, a line of low stone wall, and a strip of lonely brown hill, with the sunset clouds sailing heavily over it before me, and a strong, steady wind. No living creature was visible or audible. No bird flew by me. No dog barked from the sexton's cottage. The pauses in the dull beating of the surf were filled up by the dreary rustling of the dwarf trees near the grave, and the cold, faint bubble of the brook over its stony bed. A dreary scene and a dreary hour. My spirits sank fast as I counted out the minutes of the evening in my hiding place under the church porch. It was not twilight yet. The light of the setting sun still lingered in the heavens, and little more than the first half hour of my solitary watch had elapsed, when I heard footsteps and a voice. The footsteps were approaching from the other side of the church, and the voice was a woman's. "Don't you fret, my dear, about the letter," said the voice. "I gave it to the lad quite safe, and the lad, he took it from me without a word. He went his way, and I went mine, and not a living soul followed me afterwards, that I'll warrant." These words strung up my attention to a pitch of expectation that was almost painful. There was a pause of silence, but the footsteps still advanced. In another moment, two persons, both women, passed within my range of view from the porch window. They were walking straight towards the grave, and therefore they had their backs turned towards me. One of the women was dressed in a bonnet and shawl. The other wore a long traveling cloak of a dark blue color, with the hood drawn over her head. A few inches of her gown were visible below the cloak. My heart beat fast as I noted the color. It was white. After advancing about halfway between the church and the grave, they stopped, and the woman in the cloak turned her head towards her companion. But her side face, which a bonnet might now have allowed me to see, was hidden by the heavy projecting edge of the hood. "Mind you keep that comfortable warm cloak on," said the same voice which I had already heard, the voice of the woman in the shawl. "Mrs. Todd is right about your looking too particular yesterday, all in white. I'll walk about a little while you're here, churchyards being not and all in my way, whatever they may be in yours. Finish what you want to do before I come back, and let us be sure and get home again before night." With those words she turned about, and retracing her steps, advanced with her face towards me. It was the face of an elderly woman, brown, rugged, and healthy, with nothing dishonest or suspicious in the look of it. Close to the church she stopped to pull her shawl closer round her. "Queer," she said to herself, "always queer with her whims and her way, ever since I can remember her. Harmless, though, as harmless, poor soul, as a little child." She sighed, looked about the burial ground nervously, and shook her head as if the dreary prospect by no means pleased her, and disappeared round the corner of the church. I doubted for a moment whether I ought to follow and speak to her or not. My intense anxiety to find myself face to face with her companion helped me to decide in the negative. I could ensure seeing the woman in the shawl by waiting near the churchyard until she came back. Although it seemed more than doubtful whether she could give me the information of which I was in search. The person who had delivered the letter was of little consequence. The person who had written it was the one center of interest, and the one source of information. And that person, I now felt convinced, was before me in the churchyard. While these ideas were passing through my mind, I saw the woman in the cloak approach close to the grave and stand looking at it for a little while. She then glanced all round her and, taking a white linen cloth or a handkerchief from under her cloak, turned aside towards the brook. The little stream ran into the churchyard under a tiny archway at the bottom of the wall, and ran out again after a winding course of a few dozen yards under a similar opening. She dipped the cloth in the water and returned to the grave. I saw her kiss the white cross, then kneel down before the inscription and apply her wet cloth to the cleansing of it. After considering how I could show myself with the least possible chance of frightening her, I resolved to cross the wall before me, to skirt round it outside, and to enter the churchyard again by the stile near the grave, in order that she might see me as I approached. She was so absorbed over her employment that she did not hear me coming until I had stepped over the stile. Then she looked up, started to her feet with a faint cry, and stood facing me in speechless and motionless terror. "Don't be frightened," I said. "Surely you remember me." I stopped while I spoke, then advanced a few steps gently, and stopped again, and so approached by little and little till I was close to her. If there had been any doubt still left in my mind, it must have been now set at rest. There, speaking affrightedly for itself, there was the same face confronting me over Mrs. Fairley's grave, which had first looked into mine on the high road by night. "You remember me," I said. "We met very late, and I helped you find the way to London. Surely you have not forgotten that." Her features relaxed, and she drew a heavy breath of relief. I saw the new life of recognition stirring slowly under the death-like stillness which fear had set on her face. "Don't attempt to speak to me just yet," I went on. "Take time to recover yourself. Take time to feel quite certain that I am a friend." "You are very kind to me," she murmured, "as kind now as you were then." She stopped, and I kept silence on my side. I was not granting time for composure to her only, I was gaining time also for myself. Under the wan, wild evening light, that woman and I were met together again, a grave between us, the dead about us, the lonesome hills closing us round on every side. The time, the place, the circumstances under which we now stood face to face in the evening stillness of that dreary valley, the lifelong interest which might hang suspended on the next chance words that passed between us. The sense that, for aught I knew to the contrary, the whole future of Laura Fairley's life might be determined for good or evil by my winning or losing the confidence of the forlorn creature who stood trembling by her mother's grave, all threatened to shake the steadiness and self-control on which every inch of the progress I might yet make now depended. I tried hard, as I felt this, to possess myself of all my resources. I did my utmost to turn the few moments for reflection to the best account. "Are you calmer now?" I said, as soon as I thought it time to speak. "Can you talk with me without feeling frightened and without forgetting that I am a friend?" "How did you come here?" she asked, without noticing what I had just said to her. "Don't you remember my telling you when we last met that I was going to Cumberland?" "I have been in Cumberland ever since. I've been staying all the time at Limmeridge House." "At Limmeridge House?" Her pale face brightened as she repeated the words, her wandering eyes fixed on me with a sudden interest. "How happy you must have been! she said, looking at me eagerly, without a shadow of its former distrust left in her expression. I took advantage of her newly aroused confidence in me to observe her face, with an attention and a curiosity which I had hitherto restrained myself from showing for caution's sake. I looked at her, with my mind full of that other lovely face which I had so ominously recalled her to my memory on the terrace by moonlight. I had seen Anne Catherick's likeness in Miss Fairley. I now saw Miss Fairley's likeness in Anne Catherick. I saw it all the more clearly because the points of dissimilarity between the two were presented to me as well as the points of resemblance. In the general outline of the countenance and general proportion of the features, in the color of the hair and in the little nervous uncertainty about the lips, in the height and size of the figure and the carriage of the head and body, the likeness appeared even more startling than I had ever felt it to be yet. But there the resemblance ended, and the dissimilarity in details began. The delicate beauty of Miss Fairley's complexion, the transparent clearness of her eyes, the smooth purity of her skin, the tender bloom of color on her lips were all missing from the worn, weary face that was now turned towards mine. Although I hated myself even for thinking such a thing, still, while I looked at the woman before me, the idea would force itself into my mind that one sad change in the future was all that was wanting to make the likeness complete, which I now saw to be so imperfect in detail. If ever sorrow and suffering set their profaning marks on the youth and beauty of Miss Fairley's face, then, and only then, Anne Catherick and she would be the twin sisters of chance resemblance, the living reflections of one another. I shuddered at the thought. There was something horrible in the blind, unreasoning distrust of the future, which the mere passage of it through my mind seemed to imply. It was a welcome interruption to be roused by feeling Anne Catherick's hand laid on my shoulder. The touch was as stealthy and as sudden as that other touch, which had petrified me from head to foot on the night when we first met. "You are looking at me, and you are thinking of something," she said, with her strange, breathless rapidity of utterance. "What is it?" "Nothing extraordinary," I answered. "I was only wondering how you came here." "I came with a friend who is very good to me. I have only been here 2 days." "And you found your way to this place yesterday?" "How do you know that?" "I only guessed it." She turned from me and knelt down before the inscription once more. "Where should I go if not here?" she said. "The friend who is so better than a mother to me is the only friend I have to visit at Limmeridge. Oh, it makes my heart ache to see the stain on her tomb. It ought to be kept white as snow for her sake. I was tempted to begin cleaning it yesterday, and I can't help coming back to go on with it today. Is there anything wrong with that? I hope not. Surely nothing can be wrong if I do it for Mrs. Fairley's sake." The old grateful sense of her benefactress's kindness was evidently the ruling idea still in the poor creature's mind, the narrow mind which had but too plainly opened to no other lasting impressions since that first impression of her younger and happier days. I saw that my best chance of winning her confidence lay in encouraging her to proceed with the artless employment which she had come into the burial ground to pursue. She resumed it at once, on my telling her she might do so, touching the hard marble as tenderly as if it had been a sentient thing, and whispering the words of the inscription to herself over and over again, as if the lost days of her girlhood had returned, and she was patiently learning her lesson once more at Mrs. Fairley's knees. "Should you wonder very much," I said, preparing the way as cautiously as I could for the questions that were to come, "if I owned that it is a satisfaction to me, as well as a surprise, to see you here? I felt very uneasy about you after you left me in the cab." She looked up quickly and suspiciously. "Uneasy," she repeated. "Why?" "A strange thing happened after we parted that night. 2 men overtook me in a chaise. They did not see where I was standing, but they stopped near me and spoke to a policeman on the other side of the way." She instantly suspended her employment. The hand holding the damp cloth with which she had been cleaning the inscription dropped to her side. The other hand grasped the marble cross at the head of the grave. Her face turned towards me slowly, with the blank look of terror set rigidly on it once more. I went on at all hazards. It was too late now to draw back. "The 2 men spoke to the policeman," I said, "and asked him if he had seen you. He had not seen you, and then one of the men spoke again and said you had escaped from his asylum." She sprang to her feet as if my last words had set the pursuers on her track. "Stop and hear the end," I cried. "Stop, and you shall know how I befriended you. A word from me would have told the men which way you had gone, and I never spoke that word. I helped your escape. I made it safe and certain. Think. Try to think. Try to understand what I tell you." Her manner seemed to influence her more than my words. She made an effort to grasp the new idea. Her hands shifted the damp cloth hesitatingly from one to the other, exactly as they had shifted the little traveling bag on the night when I first saw her. Slowly, the purpose of my words seemed to force its way through the confusion and agitation of her mind. Slowly, her features relaxed, and her eyes looked at me, with their expression gaining in curiosity what it was fast losing in fear. "You don't think I ought to be back in the asylum, do you?" she said. "Certainly not. I am glad you escaped from it. I am glad I helped you." Yes, you did help me indeed. You helped me at the hard part," she went on a little vacantly. "It was easy to escape, or I should not have got away. They never suspected me as they suspected the others. I was so quiet and so obedient and so easily frightened. The finding London was the hard part, and there you helped me. Did I thank you at the time? I thank you now, very kindly." "Was the asylum far from where you met me? Come, show that you believe me to be your friend and tell me where it was." She mentioned the place, a private asylum, as its situation informed me, a private asylum not very far from the spot where I had seen her, and then, with evident suspicion of the use to which I might put her answer, anxiously repeated her former inquiry. "You don't think I ought to be taken back, do you?" "Once again, I'm glad you escaped. I'm glad you prospered well after you left me. You said you had a friend in London to go to. Did you find your friend?" "Yes, it was very late, but there was a girl up at needlework in the house, and she helped me to rout Mrs. Clements. Mrs. Clements is my friend, a good, kind woman, but not like Mrs. Fairley. No, nobody is like Mrs. Fairley." "Is Mrs. Clements an old friend of yours? Have you known her a long time?" "Yes, she was a neighbor of ours once at home in Hampshire, and liked me and took care of me when I was a little girl. Years ago, when she went away from us, she wrote down in my prayer book for me where she was going to live in London, and she said, 'If you are ever in trouble, Anne, come to me. I have no husband alive to say me nay, and no children to look after, and I will take care of you.' Kind words, were they not? I suppose I might remember them because they were kind. It's little enough I remember besides. Well, little enough. Had you no father or mother to take care of you?" "Father? I never saw him. I never heard Mother speak of him. Father? Dear, he is dead, I suppose. And your mother?" "I don't get on well with her. We are a trouble and a fear to each other." "A trouble and a fear to each other?" At those words, the suspicion crossed my mind, for the first time, that her mother might be the person who had placed her under restraint. "Don't ask me about my mother," she went on. "I'd rather talk of Mrs. Clements. Mrs. Clements is like you. She doesn't think I ought to be back in the asylum, and she's as glad as you are that I escaped from it. She cried over my misfortune and said it must be kept secret from everybody." Her misfortune? In what sense was she using that word? In a sense which might explain her motive in writing the anonymous letter? In a sense which might show it to be the too common and too customary motive that has led many a woman to interpose anonymous hindrances to the marriage of the man who has ruined her? I resolved to attempt the clearing up of this doubt. Before more words had passed between us on either side. "What misfortune?" I asked. "Oh, the misfortune of my being shut up," she answered, with every appearance of feeling surprised at my question. What other misfortune could there be? I determined to persist as delicately and forbearingly as possible. It was of very great importance that I should be absolutely sure of every step in the investigation which I now gained in advance. "There is another misfortune," I said, "to which a woman may be liable, and by which she may suffer lifelong sorrow and shame." "What is it?" she asked eagerly. "The misfortune of believing too innocently in her own virtue and in the faith and honor of the man she loves," I answered. She looked up at me with the artless bewilderment of a child. Not the slightest confusion or change of color, not the faintest trace of any secret consciousness of shame struggling to the surface, appeared in her face. That face which betrayed every other emotion with such transparent clearness. No words that ever were spoken could have assured me, as her look and manner now assured me, that the motive which I had assigned for her writing the letter and sending it to Miss Fairley was plainly and distinctly the wrong one. That doubt, at any rate, was now set at rest, but the very removal of it opened a new prospect of uncertainty. The letter, as I knew from positive testimony, pointed at Sir Percival Glyde, though it did not name him. She must have had some strong motive, originating from some deep sense of injury, for secretly denouncing him to Miss Fairley in such terms as she had employed, and that motive was unquestionably not to be traced to the loss of her innocence and her character. Whatever wrong he might have inflicted on her was not of that nature. Of what nature could it be? "I don't understand you," she said, after evidently trying hard and trying in vain to discover the meaning of the words that I had last said to her. "Never mind," I answered. "Let us go on with what we were talking about. Now, tell me how long you stayed with Mrs. Clements in London, and how you came here." "How long?" she repeated. "I stayed with Mrs. Clements till we both came to this place 2 days ago." "You are living in the village, then?" I said. "It is strange I should not have heard of you, though you've only been here 2 days." No, not in the village. 3 miles away at a farm. Do you know the farm? They call it Todd's Corner." I remembered the place perfectly. We had often passed by it in our drives. It was one of the oldest farms in the neighborhood, situated in a solitary, sheltered spot, inland at the junction of 2 hills. "They are relations of Mrs. Clements at Todd's Corner," she went on, "and they had often asked her to go and see them. She said she would go and take me with her for the quiet and the fresh air. It was very kind, was it not? I would have gone anywhere to be quiet and safe and out of the way. But when I heard that Todd's Corner was near Limmeridge, I was so happy I would have walked all the way barefoot to get here and see the schools and the village and Limmeridge House again. They are very good people at Todd's Corner. I hope I shall stay there a long time. There's only one thing I don't like about them and don't like about Mrs. Clements." "What is it?" "Oh, They will tease me about dressing all in white. They say it looks so particular. How do they know? Mrs. Fairley knew best. Mrs. Fairley would never have made me wear this ugly blue cloak. Oh, she was fond of white in her lifetime, and here is white stone about her grave, and I'm making it whiter for her sake. She often wore white herself, and she always dressed her little daughter in white. Is Miss Fairley well and happy? Does she wear white now as she used to when she was a girl? Her voice sank when she put the questions about Miss Fairley, and she turned her head further and further away from me. I thought I detected, in the alteration of her manner, an uneasy consciousness of the risk she had run in sending the anonymous letter, and I instantly determined so to frame my answer as to surprise her into owning it. Miss Fairley is not very well or happy this morning, I said. She murmured a few words, but they were spoken so confusedly and in such a low tone that I could not even guess at what they meant. Did you ask me why Miss Fairley was neither well nor happy this morning? I continued. No, she said quickly and eagerly. Oh, no, I never asked that. I will tell you without your asking, I went on. Miss Fairley has received your letter. She had been down on her knees for quite some little time past, carefully removing the last weather stains left about the inscription while we were speaking together. The first sentence of the words I had just addressed to her made her pause in her occupation and turn slowly without rising from her knees so as to face me. The second sentence literally petrified her. The cloth she had been holding dropped from her hands. Her lips fell apart. All the little color that there was naturally in her face left it in an instant. How do you know? She said faintly. Who showed it to you? The blood rushed back into her face, rushed overwhelmingly as the sense rushed upon her mind that her own words had betrayed her. She struck her hands together in despair. I never wrote it, she gasped affrightedly. I know nothing about it. Yes, I said, you wrote it, and you know about it. It was wrong to send such a letter. It was wrong to frighten Miss Fairley. If you had anything to say that it was right and necessary for her to hear, you should have gone yourself to Limmeridge House. You should have spoken to the young lady with your own lips. She crouched down over the flat stone of the grave till her face was hidden on it and made no reply. Miss Fairley will be as good and kind to you as her mother was, if you mean well, I went on. Miss Fairley will keep your secret and not let you come to any harm. Will you see her tomorrow at the farm? Will you meet her in the garden at Limmeridge House? Oh, if I could die and be hidden and at rest with you. Her lips murmured the words close to the gravestone, murmured them in tones of passionate endearment to the dead remains beneath. You know how I love your child for your sake. Oh, Mrs. Fairley, tell me how to save her. Be my darling and my mother once more, and tell me what to do for the best. I heard her lips kissing the stone. I saw her hands beating on it passionately. The sound and the sight deeply affected me. I stooped down and took the poor helpless hands tenderly in mine and tried to soothe her. It was useless. She snatched her hands from me and never moved her face from the stone. Seeing the urgent necessity of quieting her at any hazard and by any means, I appealed only to the anxiety that she had appeared to feel in connection with me and with my opinion of her, the anxiety to convince me of her fitness to be mistress of her own actions. Come, I said gently, try to compose yourself, or you will make me alter my opinion of you. Don't let me think that the person who put you in the asylum might have had some excuse. The next words died away on my lips. The instant I risked that chance reference to the person who had put her in the asylum, she sprang up on her knees. A most extraordinary and startling change passed over her. Her face, at all ordinary times so touching to look at, in its nervous sensitiveness, weakness, and uncertainty, became suddenly darkened by an expression of maniacally intense hatred and fear, which communicated a wild, unnatural force to every feature. Her eyes dilated in the dim evening light like the eyes of a wild animal. She caught up the cloth that had fallen at her side as if it had been a living creature that she could kill, and crushed it in both her hands with such convulsive strength that the few drops of moisture left in it trickled down onto the stone beneath her. "Talk of something else," she said, whispering through her teeth. "I shall lose myself if you talk of that." Every vestige of the gentler thoughts which I had filled her mind hardly a minute since seemed to have been swept from it now. It was evident that the impression left by Miss Fairley's kindness was not, as I had supposed, the only strong impression on her memory. With the grateful remembrance of her school days at Limmeridge, there existed the vindictive remembrance of the wrong inflicted on her by her confinement in the asylum. Who had done that wrong? Could it really be her mother? It was hard to give up pursuing the inquiry to that final point, but I forced myself to abandon all idea of continuing it. Seeing her as I saw her now, it would have been cruel to think of anything but the necessity and the humanity of restoring her composure. "I will talk of nothing to distress you," I said soothingly. "You want something," she answered, sharply and suspiciously. "Don't look at me like that. Speak to me. Tell me what you want." "I only want you to quiet yourself, and when you are calmer, to think over what I have said." "Said?" She paused, twisted the cloth in her hands backwards and forwards, and whispered to herself, "What is it he said?" She turned again towards me and shook her head impatiently. "Why don't you help me?" she asked with angry suddenness. Yes, I said. "I will help you, and you will soon remember. I asked you to see Miss Fairley tomorrow and tell her the truth about the letter." "Ah, Miss Fairley. The mere utterance of the loved, familiar name seemed to quiet her. Her face softened and grew like itself again. "You need have no fear of Miss Fairley," I continued, "and no fear of getting into trouble through the letter. She knows so much about it already that you will have no difficulty in telling her all. There can be little necessity for concealment where there is hardly anything left to conceal. You mention no names in the letter, but Miss Fairley knows that the person you write of is Sir Percival Glyde." The instant I pronounced that name, she started to her feet, and a scream burst from her that rang through the churchyard and made my heart leap in me with the terror of it. The dark deformity of the expression which had just left her face lowered on it once more with doubled and trebled intensity. The shriek at the name, the reiterated look of hatred and fear that instantly followed, told all. Not even a last doubt now remained. Her mother was guiltless of imprisoning her in the asylum. A man had shut her up, and that man was Sir Percival Glyde. The scream had reached other ears than mine. On one side, I heard the door of the sexton's cottage open. On the other, I heard the voice of her companion, the woman in the shawl, the woman whom she had spoken of as Mrs. Clements. I'm coming!" cried the voice from behind the clump of dwarf trees. In a moment more, Mrs. Clements hurried into view. "Who are you?" she cried, facing me resolutely as she set her foot on the stile. "How dare you frighten a poor helpless woman like that?" She was at Anne Catherick's side, and had put one arm around her before I could answer. "What is it, my dear?" she said. "What has he done to you?" "Nothing," the poor creature answered. "Nothing. I'm only frightened." Mrs. Clements turned on me with a fearless indignation for which I respected her. "I should be heartily ashamed of myself if I deserved that angry look," I said, "but I do not deserve it. I have unfortunately startled her without intending it. This is not the first time she has seen me. Ask her yourself, and she will tell you that I am incapable of willingly harming her, or any woman." I spoke distinctly so that Anne Catherick might hear and understand me, and I saw the words and their meaning had reached her. Yes, yes, she said. He was good to me once. He helped me. She whispered the rest into her friend's ear. Strange indeed, said Mrs. Clemens with a look of perplexity. It makes all the difference, though. I'm sorry I spoke so rough to you, sir, but you must own that appearances look suspicious to a stranger. It's more my fault than yours for humoring her whims and letting her be alone in such a place as this. Come, my dear, come home now. I thought the good woman looked a little uneasy at the prospect of the walk back, and I offered to go with them until they were both within sight of home. Mrs. Clemens thanked me civilly and declined. She said they were sure to meet some of the farm laborers as soon as they got to the moor. Try to forgive me, I said when Anne Catherick took her friend's arm to go away. Innocent as I had been of any intention to terrify and agitate her, my heart smote me as I looked at the poor, pale, frightened face. I will try, she answered, but you know too much. I'm afraid you'll always frighten me now. Mrs. Clemens glanced at me and shook her head pityingly. Good night, sir. You couldn't help it, I know, but I wish it was me you had frightened and not her. They moved away a few steps. I thought they had left me, but Anne suddenly stopped and separated herself from her friend. Wait a little, I must say goodbye. She returned to the grave, rested both hands tenderly on the marble cross, and kissed it. I'm better now, she said, looking up at me quietly. I forgive you. She joined her companion again, and they left the burial ground. I saw them stop near the church and speak to the sexton's wife, who had come from the cottage and had waited, watching us from a distance. Then they went on again up the path that led to the moor. I looked after Anne Catherick as she disappeared, till all trace of her had faded in the twilight. Looked as anxiously and sorrowfully as if that was the last I was to see in this weary world of the woman in white. And I think that is a pretty good point to stop tonight. So we will pick back up next week, same time. I've decided to stick with the schedule of doing Wednesdays at 8 o'clock Central Time. So I hope everyone has a nice night,